This video is Chapter 26 Notes, Part 1, all about hormones and the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is a bunch of glands. Glands are organs, and they are organs that make hormones. So the endocrine system are glands that release hormones. A hormone is a protein, and that protein gets used somewhere else. So, for example, a hormone like testosterone that's produced in the testicles might get used to make something happen in the body elsewhere. So, for example, testosterone is responsible for like facial hair. So it's produced in one place, but potentially used somewhere else. So how do hormones work? Hormones are chemical signals that are carried in the blood. So they're released in one part of the body. They then go into the bloodstream where they flow to a specific target. Not every cell can respond to the same hormones. Listed on this slide, there's some examples of common hormones that you might be a little bit familiar with. I'll just talk about a couple. So epinephrine has to do with like adrenaline, raises your blood pressure, bringing more oxygen and more sugar to your muscle cells so that you're ready for fight or flight. Melatonin is responsible for circadian rhythm, meaning your body knowing when it's night and when to sleep versus when it's time to wake up. You have hormones that are responsible for regulating body temperature, making your veins bigger or making your veins smaller. If you're very hot, your veins and arteries get a little bit wider so that heat can leave your bloodstream and go into the air, thus cooling you off. Whereas if you're very cold, your veins and arteries constrict and get a little bit smaller, keeping your blood closer to the core of your body where it is warmer. Other hormones are responsible for water retention, like how much you pee out. If you're very dehydrated, you should not be peeing out large volumes of urine. Hormones, of course, are responsible for reproduction, making egg, making sperm, but also controlling your blood sugar levels, controlling when you feel hungry. So thinking big picture, hormones are proteins. They are proteins that are carried in the bloodstream. They are released in one part of the body, and they are used in a different part of the body. Here's a few more examples of what hormones do. They control milk production, hibernation, growth of an organism through different stages. Shown here is a chicken, how artificially giving chickens growth hormone has changed the average size of a chicken. So hormones control a lot of different processes in organisms. There's two main ways that hormones work. Of course, hormones are released in one cell and used somewhere else. So both of these diagrams show that. In diagram number 1, we have a hormone shaped like this little orange droplet. That hormone gets released. That hormone then would flow in the bloodstream until it reaches its target cell. The target cell then has a specific receptor that can bind that hormone. Not every cell in the body would have that correctly shaped receptor, and thus the hormone only works on certain types of cells, which we call the target cells. So for example, ADH, which controls how much urine you pee out, would have target cells in the kidney controlling how much water stays in the bloodstream and how much water is peed out. That ADH, which has a specific shape, would not find a receptor on like your cheek cell. So it's only targeted at the cells in the kidney. It's all due to protein shape of that receptor. After the molecule, after the hormone binds, the receptor would change shape, and that would result in shape change of other proteins, kind of like a domino effect. Once you tip the first domino, all the subsequent dominoes will fall. That will then cause the cell to do some kind of response, such as maintain or release water. So that is pathway number 1, where there's a receptor in the membrane, meaning the hormone never enters the target cell. It just binds to the receptor. Pathway number 2 shows that the hormone is released into the bloodstream, and then the hormone itself can go into the target cell. That is not what we saw in the top picture, where the hormone never entered the actual cell. So in pathway number 2, the hormone enters the cell, goes into the nucleus, and causes some kind of response. In both of these scenarios, that response is a DNA response, meaning a gene is turned on or a gene is turned off. You, in your body cells, have 25,000 genes. Not all of those genes are being used at any given moment. At one point, you were a nice little circular egg cell. You were one cell big. At some point, when there were a few more cells, your body had to determine which end is going to be your head and which end is going to be a toe. Now, in your body, those genes are off. Your body now does not need to make more heads and make more toes. So those genes are now turned off. Similarly, many of your genes are turned off in different cells. For example, if someday you are a female and you have a baby, you might start producing milk. Right now, as a teenager, you have that gene to produce milk. That gene gets flicked on like a switch by a hormone after delivery of a baby. So even though you have genes now, they might be switched in the off position. A hormone causes a response, and that response is flicking a gene on or off. Shown on the next slide are those same 2 pathways. So in protein signaling, we have a signal binding to a receptor. That signal is not entering the cell, but the message gets passed amongst proteins, eventually turning genes on or off. In pathway number 2, we have the hormone actually go into the target cell. So these are different pathways. Again, we have genes turned on or off. Generally, the pathway on the left is a little more temporary, maybe like our urine example, or our vasodilation, making your veins and arteries bigger, smaller based on how cold you are. That's more of a temporary change. It's not going to influence you for months and months. It's very temporary, maybe a couple minutes, couple hours. Whereas pathway number 2 is a little bit more permanent. Not 100% permanent, but a little bit more permanent, maybe like the milk production, where you could then potentially produce milk for however long is necessary. Very important is the shape of that receptor molecule and the shape of the hormone. The only way that hormones work is by their shape fitting into a receptor. So here we have a receptor on the DNA where that little hormone has to perfectly fit into the protein receptor. Same thing here. We have the shape of a hormone that perfectly fits into a receptor. A lot of the College Board AP questions have to do with how these pathways can then get screwed up. And they can get screwed up because some molecules might have the same shape of a hormone, and thus the cell thinks a hormone is there, even though it's technically not there. So we're going to look at some examples of that now. We call those molecules endocrine disruptors. They are a molecule that has a similar shape to a hormone, and thus it acts as a chemical trick where the body thinks that something is there that isn't actually there. We see that in this diagram on the top left. My receptor has a specific shape. My hormone will perfectly fit into that shape. But wait, there is another molecule, the disruptor, that also can fit into that shape. So this artificial chemical could cause the cell to respond when it really shouldn't. Probably the most common example of this is BPA, bisphenol A. If you are somebody who carries around a water bottle, then I would look at the bottom of the bottle and see if it says BPA free. There was a huge movement a few years ago where water bottle companies all switched to BPA free, and now they use that as like a selling point. And the thing about this chemical BPA is it's a normal chemical found in plastics, but the shape of BPA is very similar to the shape of estrogen. So that's kind of highlighted here with these hydroxide groups hanging off. A normal cell should bind estrogen and then respond in a normal way. But when BPA is there, the body thinks estrogen is present when it actually is not. This can cause feminization in males, meaning where males' cells think estrogen is there, and thus a male cell starts behaving more female-like. That can influence sperm count, how well sperm can swim, and in general, just whether or not sperm can even fertilize an egg. So now a lot of water bottle companies advertise that they are BPA free, saying they won't cause feminization of males. We will now look at a few other examples. One of them is DDT. DDT was widely used in the 60s as a way to prevent crop loss for farmers. So DDT was sprayed as a pesticide. It kills bugs who eat and infect crops. So a lot of farmers in the 60s sprayed DDT, not knowing any better, just hoping to get better financial yield from their crops. But what DDT does is it is also an endocrine disruptor, and it disrupts the ability of a bird to lay eggs that have a hard shell. So it disrupts their ability to form calcium compounds in the shell of an egg. DDT is responsible for huge endangerment of large predatory birds. So bald eagles kind of get most of the fame because they're like our national symbol, but a lot of big predatory birds rapidly declined after the 60s. Essentially what would happen is the bird would eat the insects, or more likely eat the small mammals that had eaten the insects, and thus DDT accumulated at the top of the food chain. And when a female predatory bird went to lay an egg, she would then squish the egg when she sat on it, simply because the shell was not hard. So that's an endocrine disruptor. This tributyltin is another endocrine disruptor. This is a chemical that people put on the bottom of their boats to prevent drag. If you own a motorized boat, gasoline goes quite quickly. So if you have things weighing down and dragging down the boat, you will expend more gasoline and thus spend more money for doing a task, as opposed to if the bottom of the boat was perfectly smooth. So with tributylin, we saw that there was a chemical disruptor for marine snails that are kind of like barnacles, like they latch onto the bottom of the boat and then they live there. And when this chemical was painted on the bottom of boats, we saw that in these snail population, more of them became actually more masculine, and females had a harder time or the inability to reproduce. So it essentially reduced the fertility of females until it was eventually banned. My parents live in Florida. This is them on the bottom right, and they live right by Lake Apopka, right by Orlando. Lake Apopka has spent over $100 million to try to restore the lake to what it once was. And the problem with Lake Apopka is that there used to be a lot of orange groves and agriculture fields by the lake. And unfortunately, people sprayed insecticide, again, good intentions to keep their crops growing, but the insecticide went into the lake and accumulated in the lake. There's a whole lot of alligators in Florida, and what researchers saw in the lake is that the male alligators became more and more feminine to the point where they could no longer successfully reproduce in that lake. So this is another example of a chemical that has screwed up the hormones in an organism. There are many, many examples of this, and you will research one in like a PowerPoint presentation, but a few more about plastic, because there's a lot of plastic pollution and a lot of chemicals in plastic. Here's an example of a lake in DC where the male fish started becoming more and more female. They started producing eggs. The females became a little bit less female, and so thus there wasn't a clear line between which fish are male and which fish are female. This is a problem when it comes to reproducing. You need healthy eggs and healthy sperm. So if neither are quite right, there will be big problems. Another example in the UK, again, we have intersex fish. Males are not quite 100% male, they're intersex. As you know, we as humans consume a ton of plastic. Plastic pollution is a major problem. Plastic is everywhere. It comes around the food you eat. It is in the fibers in your clothes. It's in a lot of cosmetic problems. We all as humans use, consume, and waste a lot of plastic. The plastic that we throw away, you and I probably never see again. There's a lot of places in the world that don't have proper garbage disposal, and thus the plastic ends up quite close to home, usually in bodies of water. There was an accidental experiment done in 1992 when a cargo ship leaving Japan spilled 29,000 rubber duckies. It was a total freak accident, but decades later, these rubber duckies are still showing up, and they're showing up all over the world. So the idea is that if you dispose of a piece of plastic at point A, it could end up on the other side of the world. You can read a little bit more about some endocrine disruptors, and you'll also research one.